VFW Solana Beach, and we are doing an in-person gathering today. It's our fireside series, and we have our protectors come on Zoom or come in person to share their story, and then we have a great in-person conversation afterward and just a time of really connecting. So today I'm so happy to introduce Jim Lydon. He is a retired fire chief and somebody who is just doing so many things. He continues to serve people. He has a great story. He's one of the authors in our book, Moves to Wisdom, Healing Through Veteran First Responder Narratives. And again, it is an honor to have you here, Jim. So welcome.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'm excited to kind of share the story in this platform. So as Sarah mentioned, I was an author with the book. I had been telling my story or some portions of my story in different venues for quite some time. And when I wrote the book, I really thought my story was finished, that was the end of it. The chapter in the book, I reflected on my 40 years of service in the public service, in the fire service, and the trauma exposure that took place, the burdens of leadership that I experienced, and some health challenges along the way, as well as even challenges that occurred associated with my retirement. And then life changed the assignment for me again recently, and I will go back into that in some details as we move on. But before you can understand where I'm at today, I think you need to understand where I came from and how I got to this. So today I'm going to talk a bit about some adversity in my life, my career, the resilience and where I got my resilience from my experience, the recovery process, and basically refusing to quit. So a little bit about my background, where I sort of came from. I was the youngest of 5 children. I had a very stable upbringing, did sports and scouting and basic normal childhood. I'm currently married. I've been married for 37 years. I have twins that will be 36 in the fall, and I have 5 grandchildren. And so all of those things kind of, I think, shaped me to be who I am. I had no family history in the fire service. It wasn't a lineage thing. And there was some influence from some fathers of some friends that were in the fire service. But I think I generally ended up in the fire service with an inherent desire to serve others. And I'll probably talk about where I think that came from as well. So where did my journey start? I joined a Fire Explorer program when I was 14 years old. And within months, the firehouse was my second home. I was riding on a fire engine, going on calls, training with the crews, eating, you name it. I was involved in their day-to-day business. And that's where the trauma began. Because at 14, maybe 15, I saw my first suicide victim with a gunshot. I saw a fire fatality with a burn injury, type of thing. And let me tell you, I really don't think 14-year-old, 15-year-old people are ready to process that type of stuff. And so, although I think the program was great, I had a lot of great mentors that ended up becoming peers and subordinates, through my career. But I think as we bring people into our profession, that's something we need to be aware of and what we're exposing those people to at an early age. When I was 16 years old, I was a junior in high school, and I was hired by the fire department to be a dispatcher. I worked during the week. If my work days fell during the week, I worked a 15-hour shift. If they were on the weekend, I worked a 24-hour shift. I slept in a 10 by 10 room next to the phone, next to the radio. The phone rang up in the middle of the night. I woke up, I answered the phone, took the information, dispatched the resources, that type of thing. This was before this phone number called 911 existed. It was a whole different kind of system back then in the early 80s. But I was alone in that room with quite a bit of responsibility at 16 years old. My meals were delivered to me. So you think about the space I was in. I had an attached bathroom. It's almost like a prison cell. But I was on the ground floor by myself, and that was it. And I did that for several years. Um, and so through my process of being in the Explorer Scout program and the dispatching, I learned a lot about the fire service. I learned about teamwork and camaraderie, but I also learned about some unhealthy coping cultures that existed. Alcohol use, suffering in silence, dark humor, and emotional suppression. I saw those as strength at the time because that's what everybody did. Today, I would say there's something different. I moved on to be a firefighter in the organization, and that too brought some very interesting circumstances. Um, the incidents that I responded to, the calls, because I was in my hometown where I grew up, the calls involved people I knew, friends, people I went to school with, in some cases, family members. There was one morning I was coming on shift in the morning, and we had a system where when someone called the fire department for an emergency, they flipped a switch, speakers turned on in the station, and we heard the telephone call. And so if the call was in our district, we would hear the initial call. We could get a sense for what was going on. We heard the address. We could get on the road before anybody else dispatched us or any of that kind of stuff. So it was a speed thing. And so I'm coming in on the morning shift, having my coffee. We're standing around talking. I hear the speaker click on. Start, you pause for a minute. You listen to see, what's going on. And as I'm listening, it's like, I recognize that voice. That's my mother. She's calling about my dad. My dad was having a cardiac emergency. He would be transported to the hospital by another crew. He would end up in cardiac arrest in the hospital and be resuscitated and come out and recover and live on for a number of years after that. When he finally did pass away, I was not at work. I was off duty because of a medical situation. The crew that I worked with was on duty. They ran that call. They had to call me and tell me. So again, when we talk about traumas and things like that, there's an impact there on them as well as me, right? That type of thing. So those were some of the issues with working in the hometown. Some of the things that I was affected by, because the calls were not anonymous, right? They were people I knew, and so certainly something to be aware of. There were three things that really stand out for me in my career that impacted me a lot and caused me to spiral in some cases. I had a neighbor who lived a few doors from me who was a captain in the fire department, somebody I worked with. We were buddies, that type of thing. My wife and I were engaged. I needed a day off to go to meet my wife's fiance at the time, her best friend from early life, right? And so this guy worked for me that day. He covered my shift. They ran a pretty significant incident, vegetation fire, that day. The next day he was home. He called me up in the evening and said, "Hey, can you come over and check me out a little bit? I don't feel so good." So I went over and checked him out. He was having some indigestion, which didn't surprise me based on his eating habits and some other stuff. But so I called the medics. I talked to the medics, and they said, "Take him into the ER, get him checked out." All right, fine. I'll drive him, put him in my car, drive to the emergency room. We go in, we get checked in. They take him back because he's having, maybe a cardiac related thing. So they take him back. I finish the registration. I walk into the emergency area, and within minutes, he's in cardiac arrest and is resuscitated and comes back to work for a short period of time, ends up being the best man at my wedding. But I experienced a lot of guilt from that incident because he worked for me the day before. He ran that incident, quite possibly a precursor to the event that occurred. And so there was a struggle I had to get through with that, and also the leadership of the organization really didn't handle it really well for me, and what I had just been through. It was basically like, "Hey, you're due to work tomorrow, show up." And so that was kind of, nobody ever asked how I was doing or, the impact from that. So that was one of the things that kind of like really led me to, and I'll say it now, sitting in the dark room with country music on and a 6-pack of beer, solving my problems, because that's what I did. Till my wife one day said, "Hey, you need to get your shit together." So moving on, had another incident where we had a family thing. My wife became pregnant. Life was good. We were moving on with life, bought a house, etc. And we got a notice from the doctor saying, "Hey, there's something wrong, blood test or whatever." So we spin up and, we start researching and all the bad things that could happen, etc. As it turns out, the blood test was bad because she was pregnant with twins. And, so it was a positive event, but it still had a negative impact for a period of time, that really kind of, at that particular point in time, sent me for a spin. And the reason I say that one too is these all happened within a very short window of time, to impact me. Our kids were born. They were about maybe 18 months, 2 years old. I ran a pediatric drowning call with a little girl, same size, same age as my daughter. And I can tell you that rocked my world. This girl was home for the day with grandma, fell in the backyard pool and drowned. We were as far from the hospital as we could have been in our community at that point. We worked on her. We transported her. It was a big dramatic event. We had a police escort all the way through town to the hospital, etc. I remember her parents showing up at the hospital. All of that. That incident really kind of stuck with me. It still sticks with me, not in a bad way, I'll say, but it's one of those things where, I can bring back all the details very easily. So where it really went sideways, and also then eventually positive, is, we come back from the call, we stop at the neighbor station to get some supplies. We walk into the room. There's a crowd of people in the room. The senior leader of the shift is sitting in a chair in the room, sees us walk in the room, and looks at us and says, "You guys messed up. You need to talk to somebody." And we spun around and left. And, just kind of like, "Nope, we're good." We left. We were sitting at the dinner table that night in dead silence, which is not heard of in the firehouse. And all of a sudden, one of the guys spoke up and says, "Hey, I think something's wrong." And so we started talking about what was happening to each of us. And we agreed that something was wrong. I remember an article that had been in the newspaper a few days earlier about a clinician that was doing work in the area of traumatic stress and post-trauma stress. I found the article in the recycling bin. We started making phone calls, and within roughly 48 hours, we had our first ever multi-agency debriefing of a traumatic incident. And what was a bad situation ended up turning into a positive thing, because that was the catalyst that developed our peer support program, our clinical support program, and things in moving into the future. And it led to me being an advocate for mental health, mental wellness in the profession. So those were the big incidents that occurred. The next thing that happened, sort of overlapping all of that stuff, was I had a blood vessel disorder discovered in my eyes. And I had laser treatment. They basically burned the perimeter of my retina to damage these blood vessels or whatever, try to protect my eye. And so that drowning was probably 92, probably 93. I had a blood vessel pop in my right eye, and I went completely blind in my right eye. And I was off work for 3 months. They did surgery. They went in there, they cleaned it all out, restored my vision, and I went back to work. Everything was cool. About 2 years later or so, I had a retinal detachment. We spent 6 months, multiple operations, trying to reattach the retina on my right eye unsuccessfully, and I've been permanently blind in my right eye since then. I thought my career was over. I thought the fire service was done. I was in paramedic school at the time. So I decided I need to finish paramedic school because, hey, at least I could get a job in the emergency room maybe, or do something. And I was also a general contractor on the side, and I started looking at how to expand my business. Ultimately, I would convince the fire chief that I could do my job. And I went back to work. And I worked for another 25 years, whatever it was, with a single eye. And I rose from the rank at the time of firefighter to captain, battalion chief, fire chief, and such in that condition. So what I'll say there is the worst day that you think doesn't have to define your future. Sometimes it'll just redirect you. Sometimes it reshapes you, but it doesn't have to be the end. So then my career took a trajectory that I had never anticipated. My boss at the time came to me and said, hey, I think you have a skill set to be a fire chief. And you're just not going to be the fire chief here because I'm not going anywhere, but I'll help you get ready and I'll help you get a job. And so he did. I ended up getting the job as a fire chief in a community about 45 minutes from us. I went there. I would also while I was there, end up being the assistant city manager for a while, spent some time working as the city manager before I ultimately left to my next place of employment. But there was a lot that went on to that fire chief stuff. I dealt with things that I wasn't expecting. First 3 weeks on the job, I had a volunteer firefighter arrested for arson, and had to deal with that. Terminations. I had people struggling with substance abuse. Went through some public criticism, all of those types of things, and ended up with when I was in the city manager's office, we had a public works employee that was killed on duty in a car crash. And I ended up taking the lead on the notification of all city employees, putting together a stress debriefing for, an organization that, the public works people don't deal with the same stuff we do with on a regular basis. They weren't sure what to do, all of that type of stuff. And as a leader, what I realized there, even though I was trying to process things, etc., was people expected strength and leadership from me at that moment. And I had to manage that. I had to deal with my own stuff later. And so those are some things that occurred in that organization. I left there to move to Southern California with another agency as the fire chief. And the same stuff continued. I had personnel matters there. I had substance abuse issues. I had somebody who actually helped me get the job there, who I ended up having to terminate because he was dealing with his own mental wellness and some substance abuse problems, and we couldn't get him to turn the corner. And it got into the way of the workplace and ultimately, cost him his job. And that was tough because, like I said, he had a lot to do with me getting the job. And so, it grinded on me. I was also there managing the organization during COVID. And that was as a leader in the fire service, trying to do the right things and follow guidance, and, when people didn't agree with it or did agree with it. And, just trying to navigate all that stuff was a challenge. But I also had another health issue come up. I was diagnosed with cancer, and I went through cancer treatment during COVID, in and out of medical facilities during COVID. It was a very challenging time to have to do that. But I made a commitment that because I had previously been an advocate for reduction of cancer in the fire service and had done a lot of things to put in mitigation efforts within our workforce. And so here I was with it. And so I decided my next step was I need to be a role model to beat this thing. And I went through a year's worth of various cancer treatments and never missed a day of work, except for those days where I was actually having invasive medical procedures done. And it was just a thing that I had to do. But I developed a 5-point mantra that I stuck with, and that was positive attitude, healthy diet, quality exercise, quality medical care, and a tremendous support network. And those 5 things are what got me through that cancer treatment. They would become critical again in my life a few years later. I also was connected with an organization called Fire Fellow that has a group of firefighters on bicycles that bring awareness to cancer in the fire service and efforts to reduce it, that type of thing. And so in the midst of my cancer treatment, I ended up doing a bicycle ride from the Golden Gate Bridge to Los Angeles down the Coast Highway. I finished that ride on Saturday, and on Wednesday, I started 25 days of radiation treatment. But again, it was geared towards you. If you have the right attitude and you do the right things, you can continue through life even when you're dealing with this type of a disease. So that was 2020, 2021. I came to realize that my passion for the job was no longer there. I was burned out. I was tired of the politics. My integrity was being challenged on some decisions, and I just decided my purpose in what I have to do in my life was not being fulfilled by the job, and I retired. And it was great that I retired when I did, because that same group, Fire Velo, had a bicycle ride to commemorate the 20th anniversary of 9/11, starting on August 1st, and I retired on July 2nd. So I was able to go on the ride because my boss had previously told me I couldn't go on the ride because I would be off work too long. And so we rode from the Santa Monica Pier to Ground Zero in New York on our bicycles via the Pentagon and via Flight 93 Memorial. 40-day trip, 34 days on the bicycle, about 90 miles average a day, a total of roughly 3,200 miles. So it was a great experience in my life. Like I said, at that point, I kind of thought, hey, my story's over. I've been telling my story a little bit here and there. I wrote a book or a chapter to the book, that type of thing. And in the process of writing the book, I started reflecting on this like resilience thing. Where did that come from? How, when my buddy had his event, when the baby died, when, I lost the sight in my eye, all these things, how did I not fold? As I shared, right? Lost the sight in my eye. It's like paramedic school, construction work, these are my paths, these are my options. And I looked back on it a lot, and I came to the conclusion that this was a modeled behavior of my parents. When my father survived the cardiac arrest, when my father survived getting his necktie cut in a grinder to the point where it choked him out. And, when his business burned to the ground, and 3 days later he was in business somewhere else, temporarily making things happen. Those were modeled behaviors of my parents and the way they addressed adversity and challenges in life that rubbed off on me. They set the path for me. And I truly think that that's where my resiliency process comes from. I mentioned my inherent desire to serve. My parents were always serving other people. And I think that's why I ended up in the fire service, because I saw my parents doing a life of service. My father was an orthotics and prosthetics maker. He was serving people. He was serving in the church. I mean, all that type of thing. So I really think that's where it came from. And so, again, story's over. My kids back in August, September, reached out to us and said, hey, we want to look at moving someplace where we can all afford to live. We want to go to Arkansas. You guys go with us. We thought they were crazy. We started looking at it. My wife and I came in the fall, checked it out, fell in love with it, said, yeah, let's go. We came here in January and bought a house. We were scheduled to close escrow on February 6th. On January 30th, I got up in the morning, made coffee. Everything was cool. Got back in bed, drank my coffee, went to get out of bed, and my left leg felt sort of stuck under the covers. I yanked it out of there and I put it on the ground and it fell asleep. And I started walking into the bathroom and was stumbling a little bit and bumped into the wall as I went through the bathroom door. I started processing in my mind what was happening. I said, I think you're having a stroke. And I started doing a stroke test in the bathroom because it was in my background. And I assessed myself and I said, yeah, by God, you're having a stroke. And I went back out and I told my wife to call 911. Went back in the bedroom to get my phone to call a neighbor upstairs to come down and help me. I slipped off the bed and I was paralyzed on my left side and unable to move. I was taken to the hospital. I was put in a drug trial for a clot. They determined I had a hemorrhage in my brain, which is not good. They gave me a medication, 50-50 chance of getting it. They gave me an injection, and about an hour later, I was starting to move my left foot, lower left leg. I think I got the meds. I would go on to spend 3 weeks in the hospital and rehab before discharging. My wife said, hey, remember, I said we were closing escrow on February 6th. We were supposed to drive to Arkansas that day and take possession of the house. My wife says, we just need to back out of this deal. I said, no, we're not backing out. You're going to Arkansas. You're taking possession of the house. We need to move forward. This is the plan. Here's where some amazement comes in. I have a neighbor who's also a firefighter in another community. He drove my wife to Arkansas. I had a guy that I worked with 20-something years ago fly from Reno to meet her. And do all the stuff I was supposed to do. I had people from Coronado load the car for her. That support network came to life again. It was a critical piece to making it successful. She came back. We owned the house. I got discharged. They made me go out in a wheelchair, but by the time I left that hospital in 3 weeks, I was walking. The wheelchair never got taken out of the car. I walked into my house. Within a few days, I ditched the cane, the ankle brace they had on me. And within a week or two, my arm was back to doing its thing. So I got discharged on the 20th of February. On the 18th of March, I drove from San Diego to Arkansas. And we started our new life. And so with that, I want to sort of close out here with some key things. I mentioned, friends stepping up. And what I learned through this whole process is that the strongest people are not independent people. They're connected people. They are people who can demonstrate some humility from time to time and ask for help. That was difficult because, I was asking for a lot of help. I was asking people to help me shower and things that I never expected to have to do in my life. So with that, I've mentioned this before, your worst day does not define your future. Some of the moments I feared most eventually became the moments that reshaped me. That's all they were. They were something that reshaped me. Asking for help is a strength, not a weakness. Healing's not linear. There's going to be progress. There's going to be setbacks, but it requires patience and persistence. And that's what I was focused on. Your purpose matters. I've worked on my purpose for a long time. I know my purpose, and it's been the same for a number of years. And it's to focus beyond self to help others be better. And I use that every day to make decisions about what I commit to and what I don't commit to and what I do for other people. Ultimately, your story matters, and everybody has a story. Everybody has scars. Some are visible, some are invisible, some are from service, and some are from life. But the scars are not proof that we were defeated. They're proof that we survived. That's what I got for you.
Jim, thank you so much. Your story never gets old. It's powerful. I think just as we were talking on our call, on Friday, which the three of us were on, just what a powerful elasticity you have. Right? And it's what a legacy your parents left. Just modeling that really powerful ability to pivot, adjust, the elasticity that they have, the resilience, I'm going to use that word. It's so great to hear you break that down. I do have a couple questions and then I'm going to open it up to everybody. I am just very curious, even though you have been able to get up powerfully every single time, every single hard hit, right? If you think about those times when you were young, what would it have meant to you? Even in the times of having to suffer in silence and all the old school ways of, dealing with that, dealing with trauma, what would it have been like if somebody came in and debriefed during those times?
Well, it's interesting. This would have been about 1980, 81. We had a guy that worked in the fire department who was so Jeffrey Mitchell did some stuff. He wrote a book about PTSD in the early to mid 80s. But we had a guy that was working with us. He was a captain in the fire department, but he was a licensed clinician of some sort, and he actually did he tried to do a debriefing. I mentioned that burn, the burn victim. He tried to actually do some sort of debriefing back then. He gathered us all around, but it was not well received, right? It was in an era that like, you want us to get in a circle and hold hands or what. I mean, it was just like crazy stuff, right? We don't do that. And I do believe, knowing what I know now, because one thing I'll say is all of those things that I went through, they changed me so much later, because I think I became more empathetic with people. And when I saw people that were working for me going through a crisis, I had a guy who we had a baby call, right? He had a young kid at home, and I watched him. All of a sudden, I saw he was standing next to the ambulance, and I went over. I said, "Hey, are you okay?" He says, "I can't get in." He says, "You don't have to get in my truck. You go with me. You don't have to get in there. You come with me." And we talked, and I was on the phone the whole time, making phone calls to get him connected with somebody. So it changed my trajectory. I think if we'd had that same thing in the early 80s, it would have been a whole different career, right? I probably might not have had the same wisdom I have today, because I might not have had all the same scars or whatever.
I mean, it's cool that you were able to use for others what you needed at the time, even if you didn't get it. But it sounds like you're reframing all those experiences to definitely what made you into the person you are today. So, gosh, such a great story, Jim. Thank you so much for just taking the time to share with us and inspire us. It's awesome. So I want to